remote culture is not the same as office culture. They're actually fundamentally different things. They're similar, but not the same. So in an office, you could work on your vision, mission, values, and behaviors, and you could do that and do a good job of it. And then the office did the rest for you. You didn't have to worry about collaboration or people management.
It's like a crutch in some ways, right? It makes it a lot easier. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a lot easier. But now you're remote. Culture really is the way we do things around here, which includes how do we collaborate, which includes how do we manage, how do we lead. So remote companies look at culture much more broadly, and they're much more aware of their levers of culture, in my opinion.
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. The Flex Index represents more than 7,500 companies, 55,000 office locations, and 100 million people. It's a great place to start if you're looking for your next flexible work career opportunity. Today, my guest is Brett Putter. Brett is the founder and CEO of Culturegene, the developer of the hybrid management training program. In this episode, we discuss how world-leading fully remote companies like HotJar and GitLab build culture, the best practices from fully remote companies that hybrid companies should adopt, and why hybrid leaders need to be more intentional about how they implement hybrid work. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us out by subscribing and giving us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable, and it helps new listeners find the podcast. Brett, welcome.
Rob, thanks very much for having me. Great to be on the show.
Brett, I find your background fascinating because I think the journey that you've gone through to focus on some of the topics around culture that we're going to dig into today is a pretty unusual one. And if I recall correctly, I think you spent maybe the first 10 plus years of your career in exec search and then kind of found your way over there. Is that right?
Yeah. I spent 15 years as a managing partner of an international executive search firm. And we worked mainly with high growth emerging tech companies expanding into the US from Europe or US going to Europe. And that's really where my interest in culture came from in a roundabout kind of way.
And was the culture, was it something that you found to be particularly important in being successful in executive search broadly? Or do you think it was particularly important because of the geographic dispersion and what it meant to transplant from US to Europe? I'm curious why that registered so highly on your radar.
Yeah, so the geographic thing was secondary, but still important to make sure we understood what type of US company was expanding or what type of European company was expanding. But actually, when I look back at all the searches we've done over 10, 15 years, I realized that the searches that ran the smoothest and had the best outcomes for everybody were the searches where the leadership team had a very clear understanding of their culture. And that's really where it dawned on me. And we actually started helping companies then build values-based interview processes. I started getting more and more involved in actually helping companies define their values and sort of building processes around that. And that's how I got dragged in, kicking and screaming into my passion, really.
I love that. Dragged, kicking and screaming into passion. That's fantastic. You talked a little bit about documenting values. Is that what it means to have a clear sense of culture? Is there more to that? Like, how are you thinking about what you saw as the best practice in terms of truly understanding what your culture means?
So this is a great question, because documenting values is one thing, and it's important. You need your mission, your vision, your purpose, depending on how you're going to approach it. But what we realized is that the companies that really did this the best looked at culture beyond that. It's the way we do things around here. So it's not just, yes, you can tick the box and write your values and you can do all of those things, but actually the companies that really impressed me and really impressed my candidates were the ones where you could see they were living the values, and they could talk about it as if it was their right hand. They understood it. It was integrated in them because it was their values.
And so what did you do with that? Like you talked about being an executive search for 15 years and how that led you kicking and screaming into your passion area. What was the transition and kind of how did you make the transition?
Yeah. So for me, because there was such a difference in the recruitment processes where it was often harder to find candidates that matched the role, but also matched the values. But once you did, it was really clear. It was super obvious which candidate was better suited, and there was this consistency around that, which that's where for me it was, wow, this is so different. And then I realized actually in most of the companies we worked with, 9 out of 10, culture was the missing piece of the puzzle. These high growth companies don't understand necessarily, especially back then, how culture formed as being inside an office, and this osmosis and physical proximity allowed your culture to build. But then once a company started to scale, that's when the wheels started to come off a little bit. And we saw that because they were scaling to hire VP of Sales International or GM US, and we could see that the companies that had things in place and were really living their values and their culture were they just had it easier. The searches ran better. And then I thought, I want to get deeper into this. So I started studying, really researching culture, and I started interviewing CEOs of high growth companies.
And if I recall, I think you spent a lot of time doing that. It was something like 14 months, I think you said, researching and going deep on this topic.
Yeah, so I still do. I read. It's something that I'm passionate about and crazy about. So it's very hard to stop me. But as I moved from the executive search business, I probably spent over 2 years really getting my head around reading Edgar Schein's books, reading Handy's books, really understanding what the godfathers of organizational culture defined as such, and then started understanding what high growth companies did to make them successful. So that was culture more broadly. And then when the pandemic hit, that's when I had that sort of realization, hold on, remote work companies do it differently. And I spent a lot of time studying them as well.
Interesting. So before we talk about how they do it differently and some of the things that kind of work or best practice around scaling culture based on your experience, I'm curious what breaks, because I think probably a lot of startups believe in their early innings that they have a clear sense of culture. And you mentioned that at the earliest days, maybe it works. And as the company gets bigger, the wheels sometimes fall off. What were you finding as being some of the challenges or kind of like the break points that were leading to this maybe cultural watering down or lack of consistency as companies were getting a little bit bigger?
So the first thing is bad hiring, and not just at senior level, across the board. So hiring the wrong fit, and that often is because people believe they can hire for culture fit. They sort of, would I want to have a beer with this person? Do I get on with them? Do they fit my culture today? Okay, let's hire them. Versus actually, do they fit? I don't believe it's possible to hire for culture fit, because culture fit is this, it doesn't exist. No CEO I've ever met can accurately describe their culture. No CEO can actually tell me exactly what their culture is. They can talk about values and mission and vision and stuff, but that's not your culture. Your culture is bigger than that. And so for me, it was about the first one was bad hiring. Actually, the one before that was often co-founder issues. So not having that real alignment on what co-founder A and B and C really want out of this. And then the third element was pressure. When you saw pressure start to either VC pressure or fundraising pressure or client pressure
to make the hire itself.
And actually just to do whatever what work was needed.
Got it.
Then you got your default behaviors, because under pressure we go back to our default, and it's not all rosy and it's not all amazing, and so that's where you start to feel teams not working effectively. And those really were the three early signals for me that the alignment wasn't great.
What you just said around culture fit's really interesting to me, because that's a term that's bandied around by all kinds of companies, right? Like we look for culture fit or culture add. And I think you just said that you can't really do that, right? Because people don't describe the culture, or the culture is an embodiment of things that maybe are harder to communicate. So when companies do a good job at thinking about this in the hiring process, if it's not culture fit, so to speak, what is it exactly? Is it just being able to communicate values? Is it broader than that? Like how do you bring that across when it's such an amorphous amorphous idea in some ways.
I think hiring is often about luck. You can be lucky. Also, if you've done this a couple of times, your radar gets better and better and better. I mean, I've interviewed thousands and thousands of people, so you can once you've done that, you can sniff, you can sense. But actually, what we did is we built a values-based interview process. So we take a value. So let's say we are candid, or we're transparent, whatever the value is. And then we build a set of interview questions against that as behaviors. So what does it mean to be candid? It means that we tell it like it is. We won't hide. We won't talk behind anybody's backs. So we build interview questions around this. So can you give me an example of when you last had to give your team bad news, and take me through the process? And you get a sense then of how the person thought about it, how they prepared, what they did. Were they brutally honest? Did they skirt around the issues? And then because it's about actual behaviors, you can dig deeper and deeper into the question. So there are layers of why. And what we would then do is we'd score the candidate out of 5 for vividness of answer and believability. And so now it's not perfect, obviously, but you have a much better sense of the candidate if you ask each candidate exactly the same question, because now you can compare answers like for like. And the ones that really, live that value and are candid and do it respectfully and do it in a meaningful way and get the best outcomes, that comes across in the interview process.
It strikes me that there is an intentionality to that, that maybe a lot of companies, for whatever reason, maybe it's because of lack of belief of how important it is, or because of the amount of work that's required to figure it out, to ask the right questions in the interview process. But there's an intentionality to that in terms of, very specific around our values and the questions that underlie those values and how to measure them, that I'm guessing most growth companies just don't, they just don't invest in that way. Is that right?
Yeah, it's right, because most of them don't actually invest even at the value stage properly. So if you don't invest at the value stage, the dominoes are just going to knock over, and you're not going to bother with the rest of it. And also, the advantage of it is you can actually train more people to do this, to get better at this role, so you can spread the risk. But they don't think about that. They don't think about the amount of time it'll save them or help them to have people who are really, really good at doing this, doing it for them.
And you said something interesting too about remote companies. I want to come back to for a little bit earlier, that you said you spent as part of your, and I know you're still doing research all the time, but as part of your early research, you spent a lot of time with fully remote companies and some of the differences in how that culture or the intentionality around that culture manifests. Is there a particular company you spent a lot of time with early, or how did you kind of start to realize that remote companies maybe were built a little bit differently in that way versus others?
Yeah, so I was really lucky, actually, it turns out. I was approached by HotJar in 2018. So before remote was a thing or even cool. And I was interested to learn, but if I'm honest, I was super skeptical. I had a really low expectation. I just thought I was going to be trying to herd cats going in different directions. Because how on earth do you do this? They don't have an office. They obviously don't have a meaningful culture. Etc. I had all these things going through my head. And part of my process is to interview the leadership team and to interview the broader team and to ask them all exactly the same questions, because I'm looking for the similarities, I'm looking for the differences and the anomalies. And what I typically get is the leadership team thinks X, the broader team thinks maybe Y, and there is this culture gap. And actually, I was blown away by HotJar. It was like, what? It is. If I hadn't been seated, I would have fallen off my chair, because the leadership team were consistent. They could tell me about their mission, their vision, their values. They could give me examples of their team doing it. And vice versa, the leadership team actually gave me an example where the leadership, the CEO, they made a decision. It was the time of GDPR. And they made a decision that was going to cost the business money, but it was the right decision for their values. And they were super proud of it. They were like, it came through consistently. And actually, in comparison to my in-office companies were here, HotJar were far, far, far superior. Their culture was a joy to work with. The people were a joy to work with. They were just there for a different purpose. And so I thought, okay, HotJar is this weird thing, or what else is out there? So I actually spent 14 months, as you said, looking at GitLab, Zapier, TopTel, Buffer, Basecamp, Automatic, Doist, and others. And so that's really where I realized that because they don't have osmosis and because they don't have physical proximity and they can't learn through observation, these companies have had to over-index in certain areas. They've had to build best practices to overcome this lack of office advantage, really.
I'm gonna have to send this to Hotjar, by the way, because if they don't have this already on their careers page, I feel like there's probably a couple good 30-second clips in there they should be using in terms of how their culture manifests.
They're super good, actually. If you go back and you look at all the CEO's original blog posts or LinkedIn posts, there's always a link to the values. He brings them in every blog post. They're super good. I mean, if we talk a little bit more, like for example, their perks freak other companies out.
In what sense? Explain.
Maybe this you don't want to share with lots of people out there, but so when you join HotJar, they give you about $4,000 to set up your office environment. And then every year they give you 10 grand for holiday allowance, working together allowance, gym allowance, studying allowance. They make you take vacation and they actually calculate your vacation days. They give you 2 grand to go on holiday.
That's pretty astonishing.
So it's like it's mind blowing. But they did the calculations and they said instead of putting that 10 grand, which it would cost us, because it would cost about 10 grand per person a year for the office, we'll actually give it back to the individual and actually help develop them instead because they're working from home. So it's just a different mindset for them.
What's really interesting about that, Brett, is, and I know we'll talk a little more about, I'm going to go deeper on HotJar and remote companies, and we'll talk about hybrid in a minute, but it strikes me that there is a differential level of investment if you are fully remote that you can put into that experience, knowing that you won't invest in office. And that's different from a hybrid organization where maybe you're still trying to hold on to office in some way, but you also want to invest in those things. Is that right? Like, do you find that there's something kind of like different in the purity of that approach that allows for that level of investment?
Yeah, there's also a hybrid is how do we cut that cost versus how do we invest that in our people instead? So because you're comparing office to no office, whereas HotJar was saying there's no office. What are we going to do with the money? What are we going to do with that? It's not thinking about less office equals less cost equals we make more money. It's more a case of we didn't have an office anyway, but that would have cost us this. How can we reinvest? And hybrid companies, even though some of them are cutting back on offices, they're investing heavily on the office that's left. So they want to redo the offices. They want them to be more swanky and more designed around collaboration and other things. So there isn't that mindset of how do we invest in our people in the same way.
It's funny. It reminds me of a conversation we had, another episode with Hunter Walk, who's a venture capitalist, a good friend of mine, and he was really thoughtful on this topic. And he basically said, "Look, I think that fully remote companies, especially for founders that are just starting these companies, should not expect that fully remote is going to save them money. They should focus on thinking about, hey, if I'm not going to invest in office, I'm going to repurpose dollars and investing in the type of things that you're describing, which makes a lot of sense. And if you take it with that clarity, hey, this was my budget and I'm going to invest in these ways to invest in my team, knowing we don't have offices in the same way, it leads you down a very different line of thinking, it strikes me, than if you say, hey, look, we're just going to run leaner because we don't have office space.
Yeah, that's quite right. I also think that there's this... there are definitely advantages, human advantages, to being in an office, and actually investing in the well-being and the development of your people, and giving them significant firepower to do that gives you an office parity and a mindset point of view with because we were in an office, we had all these cool social things, we had all of the now I'm at home and I'm sitting in this office and I don't have anything comparable from the company. So actually investing into that individual gives them that comparison for them to be able to go and say, the company is giving me something similar. I'm getting and there is an equality. It's not the same, but there is an equality around this.
That makes sense. If you talked a little bit about HotJar and the strength of the culture and maybe alignment across the executive team and others, and we talked a little bit about some of the investment in people. What are the other things that you found that HotJar did that enabled them to form such a strong culture fully remotely? I would love to understand some of the other specific actions they took, or maybe specific investments they made.
Yeah, so I think they were very deliberate about breaking silos, because silos form naturally anyway, even when you're in the office. But actually, when you're remote, those silos are super enhanced. And one of the things they did, for example, is they created tribes, and the tribes met once a month. And the tribes were either given something to think and talk about, or they could do their own thing that month.
And they met remotely, presumably, or they met in person?
They met remotely. But actually, it was one person from sales, one person from marketing, one person from engineering, one person from customer success.
So very cross-functional in nature.
Exactly. So these tribes are cross-functional. And then the tribes would either work on something, and then the next month they would come back and give feedback and maybe work together as two tribes on a project. But ultimately, what HotJar did to overcome some of these challenges around silos and very poor team collaboration is build these tribes. Another thing that they did is they encouraged, and this is where the budget came from, they encouraged either the whole product team to go to Barcelona and work together, rent out a big Airbnb, and just work together for a week, have a good time, eat, drink, be merry. Or they would say, somebody from product, somebody from sales, somebody engineering, you go and work in Reykjavik. They were very intentional about bringing people together briefly, and obviously then they did their biannual get-togethers and their annual big events and that kind of stuff. But there was there was a lot of thought that went into the activities and the thinking around social connection and around community and around investing in the local community around you, where you live, versus thinking about the company.
It strikes me as you say that, Brett, that I think a lot of people hear fully remote and they think that means never in person. And I don't think that's accurate. In fact, like the intentionality around bringing people together at particular points in time for a particular purpose to build a relationship, collaborate, I think is really important. It just requires real thoughtfulness, it sounds like, in terms of how you execute that and the way you spend that time.
Yeah, it's super important, actually. You can see how the value of and I can't think of a company that I researched that didn't do it. That didn't do it once or twice a year, just because it was so valuable. They would mix strategy, they'd mix culture, they'd mix working together, they'd mix socializing, networking, but they would be very intentional of getting different people to meet and connect who wouldn't necessarily do that on a regular basis. So there was a lot of intentionality behind that as well. Yes.
Yeah. We had a really good conversation. Raj Chowdhury, a professor at HBS, came on and told us about some research that he had done where, similar to what you're describing, even having an offsite and getting people together for 24, 48 hours with a purpose on building social connections between people who don't spend a lot of time together necessarily, even a taxi ride between two people who haven't spent time together, had lasting positive impact for async interaction and collaboration for months afterwards. So it sounds like you're finding something very similar in practice in terms of some of the companies that you researched.
Yeah, that's right. I developed it's a part of one of the programs I've developed. It's called the Social Capital Index. And what the team, it's run by the team leader, and the team leader looks at their team and goes, who are we as a team interacting with a lot? Is Debbie not interacting with Mark at all, but Mark and Jack are interacting? So it's an internal evaluation of their social capital. but also it's an external evaluation. So who in our teams interact with which other departments and teams regularly? Who should we be interacting with? So if we aren't talking to product, why not? Let's set up a call with product and let's get Mark to talk to Jim in product. So good leaders, great managers are very, once again, intentional about making sure their social capital of their team, both internally and externally, is reinforced and is strengthened. So it's actually good that I haven't come across that research from Raj.
Yeah, it's a pretty good one, but makes a lot of sense of what you're saying, and I think that intentionality seems to be the recurring theme of some of the things you're talking about. So you mentioned a bunch of other companies that I would think of as really good fully remote standouts, right? That you've also spent time with. What other best practices to drive cultural consistency or cultural affiliation were you finding across some of those fully remote organizations?
So the first one, before I get into examples, the first one is realizing that culture is not, remote culture is not the same as office culture. They're actually fundamentally different things. They're similar, but not the same. So in an office, you could work on your vision, mission, values, and behaviors, and you could do that and do a good job of it. And then the office did the rest for you. You didn't have to worry about collaboration or people management.
It's like a crutch in some ways, right? It makes it a lot easier. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a lot easier. But now you're remote. Culture really is the way we do things around here, which includes how do we collaborate, which includes how do we manage, how do we lead. So remote companies look at culture much more broadly, and they're much more aware of their levers of culture, in my opinion. So a good example of one example that I really liked is TopTel. At the end of every meeting, they have a survey which pops up in your Slack. And the survey goes, how was the meeting? Excellent, okay, or meh, or terrible. Okay. And actually they give you the words that indicate this was excellent, this was okay, and this was terrible. And I just love that, because meetings, although meetings are not as important or as relevant in an async world, but when you have one, they are super important. Because it's synchronous and you're investing so much time in this meeting, it has to work well. So actually, if there's a bad meeting, you really want to know about it. And
you need that feedback loop. Yeah,
exactly. You really want to know about it. And you want to know about it soon, so you can first of all work out what went wrong and then just change it quickly.
I imagine it's also pretty helpful for the manager or the it shouldn't necessarily assume it's the manager, whoever owns the meeting, to be able to get that feedback and improve process and learn over time beyond just like whether it's a good use of time for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. One of my favorite examples of remote work is the GitLab handbook. And I'm sure most of your audience will have heard about it or at least looked at it. But for me, the GitLab handbook is just such an incredible work of art. I think it's now 2,700 pages and it's over 3.3 million words or something. I don't know what it is.
You want to hear a crazy stat about that, by the way, Brett? I had Darren Murph on here the other day, and Darren told me that when he got there, it was 50 pages. Yeah, to put it in perspective, right? And this is pre-IPO, and so the amount of meticulous attention they've put into that is just unbelievable.
Unbelievable. And actually, they've now, I can't remember what it's called, but they've got a service that on one of the pages it actually shows you which pages are more used today than that. It's like, that is such a beautiful thing, and for me, that is digital art. So yeah, there are a bunch of examples of these best practices, but ultimately what I've found is that these companies have to they develop best practices that they don't all do things exactly the same way, but they do things very similarly when it comes to collaboration. So in the case of GitLab, their processes are defined, and they have been going for a little bit longer, so you can define your processes, but you can adapt those processes in the handbook anytime. When it comes to async communication, a company like HotJar actually says we're all online at this specific time. And they've got a structure around Mondays is get started day. You can do some sync, async. Tuesdays is focus day. Wednesdays, meeting free day. Thursday. So They give their teams more structure. They give their teams the ability to communicate. And in most cases, these best practices are designed around overcoming remote work friction. This idea that if we weren't in the office, how would we do it? And because of that, we've got this friction building up now. We've got friction that because we're not in the same room.
I find that's a really interesting idea. I think it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, I love the idea of thinking about you choose your model of choice for whatever reason, right? Whether it's fully remote, hybrid, whatever it might be, could be because of your personal beliefs or your experience and how you operate. But you, as an organization, you kind of like often choose based on founder, based on executive leadership, like some point of view on how you're going to approach this. And then you invest really heavily to find the gaps in that model and how you're going to kind of like fill them in, or what are the investments you have to make. My instinct is, I think a lot of organizations that are more on site or hybrid have probably not thought deliberately enough about what are the gaps and what does it mean to be really good at the remote aspect. Whereas it sounds like some of the best fully remote organizations are saying, hey, how do we think really hard about where there are fully remote gaps in our model, and investing really heavily to try and make up for that?
Yeah, you're quite right. What I'm seeing is, so, and it's not a surprise. But if you think about it, most hybrid companies, their leadership have no experience and no understanding of what it means to work in a remote work company that was designed for remote work, where their best practices are in place. So it's a little bit about, it's not knowing, like they don't know what they don't know. So how do you build a strategy if you don't know what remote work really is, and you don't know what the pitfalls of remote work really are, and you don't know what the challenges and where the friction develops? So there is this hope that if we continue to do what we do, hybrid will somehow, in the same way that the office did, it'll somehow work its way out. Because we don't know what to invest in. So if you think about it, most, not all, but most CPOs have written policies for hybrid. They've delivered tactics for hybrid, but they haven't got a strategy. And that's a little bit like packing a suitcase to go on vacation without deciding on where you're going. You won't need the ski boots on Ipanema Beach.
I love that description. That's great. And it's funny. It's true. Like I think Darren had described, I've heard a couple people say this, like, look, it's not this is not just a point of view. It's not like you say, look, we're going to be fully remote as an organization and now go forth, right? It's an operating system, right? It influences all these different things about how you operate. And another favorite of mine who we collaborate a lot with, Debbie Lovich at BCG, basically said, look, a lot of companies, like, look, if you were to go from, a transition from kind of like on-prem to cloud, for example, you wouldn't just tell people, hey, tomorrow we're on cloud and that's the end of it. Like there'd be a lot of implementation and training of things that go with that in terms of how to approach it. But we take hybrid as if it were, okay, tomorrow we're going to be hybrid and like everyone go forth and it should just work. And I think people underestimate the amount of investment that's required to make that optimal.
Yeah, and there's a good reason for that as well. So if you think about it, the senior leadership team transitioning to hybrid, their lives haven't changed that much. They always had quite a bit of flexibility. They didn't have to be anywhere and clock in. They didn't have, they could work flexibly. And then the mid-level leadership team, their roles have changed a little bit, but not too much. Where the real pain is at the management level. So people managers, their roles have become more complex because they've had to take on more responsibility. The things that used to happen in the office that don't now, or only happen somewhat now in hybrid, are on their plates. And so they're the ones who have to deal with, how do I get people to collaborate now? It's a different, you've got different personas. You've got Mark, who's 2.5 hours away because he moved out of the city. You've got Mary, who's got to go pick up her kids at 1:00. You've got Jack, who wants to be in the office every day. And you've got to, how do I make this all work now? How do I then actually bring this team together? And how do I manage in this different environment? So there's some really interesting data on the differences in management types in these different environments.
So with fully remote, one of the things I guess that makes me think of, Brett, is like these fully remote organizations that you're describing, like some of them that are best in class, have grown up fully remote. Like they started day one fully remote. The founders, the teams were all operating fully remote. They treated it as a craft and they continued to improve upon it over time, right? As you just described, a lot of these hybrid organizations started full time in office, right? And they've transitioned into hybrid. And so it's not like the company was born with hybrid DNA in that regard, right? And so that transition is different. And it strikes me that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there'll be lots of companies that grew up hybrid and will have built their own operating manuals for how to do hybrid. But in that meantime, how do you transition and teach leaders to navigate something that they haven't experienced in that kind of like from birth type of way? Like how do you train hybrid leaders and what it means to get better at this, maybe leveraging best practices from fully remote or others?
Yeah, so I've built the hybrid management training program, which works both horizontally and vertically. So the first thing is the leaders need to understand the reality of what's different, what we had and what we don't have anymore, and the impact of that. And typically, what I do is I'll go and look at their survey data. They give me access to their survey data, and I'll be able to overlay some of the challenges they're experiencing with the remote work best practices that they're not doing. And when you do that and you show them that, you go, because it's literally you're just holding a mirror up and you're saying, look, they go, oh, okay. So, and you don't always get full commitment immediately, but you get a lot more momentum behind this. And then I do the same workshop at the mid-level, so the managers of managers, the VPs and directors, so that they understand what's changed and what's different now and what we can't get back. And at the manager level, I've built a video training course, which takes the manager through the best practices. So the collaboration best practices, the people management best practices, and the team culture best practices. So to give an example of people management, experienced remote managers are outcomes based. And they input is almost irrelevant. It's about outcomes. It's about tasks. It's about projects and where the tasks, you may slip up in your tasks. It's not about anything else. It's about trust. It's about autonomy, and it's about allowing you to do what you need to do and supporting. So that's the program that we take companies through, which works at both giving real understanding and knowledge at the coalface area of what needs to change and how things need to change. And then at the leadership level and going, okay, if you want to be serious, if you want to make hybrid work and you want to become best of breed, you have to consider which of these best practices you are going to take on. So is it about documentation? Is it about social capital? Is it about well-being? Which you don't have to take all of them, but you have to go and work out where you're weak from a hybrid working remote element and strengthening those areas of your business.
Is there a challenge in getting hybrid executives to go through this process in the sense that one of the things I think about a lot is, are there CEOs or hybrid execs that aren't fully bought into the fact that the model they're in is going to be the model of the future? Meaning like in their heart of hearts, they hope that maybe 3 days a week becomes 4 days a week, becomes full-time in office at some point in time. And is there kind of like a recognition that's required first, that, hey, we're going to invest in this as our enduring model in order to even like kick off that type of thought process?
Yeah, very much so. I would say that there are lots and lots of elements of this that are proving to be a challenge, both from a property perspective and the sunk cost of all this beautiful concrete we've invested in, all the way through to leaders. So one of the other challenges, senior leaders are typically charismatic, verbal, hierarchical. They don't mind delegating stuff to people, but actually remote leaders are coaches, mentors, facilitators, project management, operations focused. And there's actually Georgia Southern University did some research on this, and they took two groups of teams and split them up. And that's how they chose their leaders in an office environment, in a remote environment. And it came out that your typical office leader is charismatic, has it's going to get people going. But getting people going in this environment doesn't work. It's not the same. You can't rely on your charisma in this. So actually, they are typically, and I'm broad strokes here, but they typically that charismatic leadership type. So they actually don't even understand how much they have to change in order to. So there are lots of pieces there, but there are lots of companies that have just put up their hand and said, our people are happier like this. We're going to make it work. We don't know what to do, and we will invest in it.
Are there hybrid companies either that you've worked with or the kind of that you've followed publicly that you think have done a really good job at moving through this process of kind of recognition that hybrid is the future for the organization, some type of analysis as to where we at relative to where we need to be from a capability perspective, the training and implementation? Like who is doing a good job at this right now?
Yeah, so the companies that are doing a good job out of this and out of the blocks are unsurprisingly also in the kind of collaboration space. So they're ahead of they understand the challenges of collaboration because they've been building stuff around. So Atlassian are doing amazing stuff in this space. SAP have got a huge team, 40, 50 people that are focusing on future of work. The guys from Dropbox also, but once again, it's around collaboration. So there are companies that are doing good stuff, and there are companies that are. I'm starting to see companies that are not necessarily with a collaboration focus that are starting to gain good traction, but generally, they are generally tech enabled, tech advanced firms that didn't mind being remote. Or remote was an option in the early days. They're not approaching it with the discipline necessarily and the intention and the rigor that's needed, but they're definitely on the way there.
Got it. Are there non-tech examples? Because to your point, I imagine that in tech it's maybe a little bit easier because you've got there's probably more demand for kind of like fully remote and flexible work. At least we've seen that kind of like historically in terms of the level of interest from employees and kind of operating in that fashion. There's probably a little bit more familiarity with the software and tooling and capabilities from a just how we collaborate perspective, as you mentioned. I've seen other organizations obviously move hybrid and employees' choice in terms of not requiring office time. Anybody else who jumps out who's like really good at this, who's not tech?
So there are divisions of big companies that I've seen have done some interesting stuff. So Robert Half are a big recruitment firm, and they've got a division who are doing a lot of testing and a lot of exploring where we can go, and they've actually gone beyond what. So the way I look at, I see hybrid, remote first, fully remote. So hybrid is mandated, or the manager decides, or the individual decides. Remote first is where we are going to operate remote first. It doesn't matter if you're in the office or not. This is a way we will do things, and they're taking a remote first approach, and they're doing some really interesting stuff. It's early days to say, what's sticking, but there are companies that are definitely moving in the right direction that aren't pure tech.
Got it. Are there people who you find or you follow that you think are particularly thoughtful in terms of how else to approach some of the transition in terms of hybrid to or maybe from on-site to hybrid in terms of the practices around that, or executives at those companies that you found to be really thoughtful? I think a lot of our listeners are often trying to figure out, okay, well, who knows stuff about this transition, both externally, but also internally, and is operating it and can use as a source of best practices and kind of getting better at this.
Yeah. So the I can't remember what CNBC called him. I think the guru of it or something. But obviously Darren Murph, who's you and I both know very well. There's Liam from Running Remote, who I think is he's really got a very broad perspective on broad. It's not just remote; it's hybrid, and he runs a very, very good event on it. There's Annie from Atlassian, who is really very thoughtful on this.
Cool. So maybe one other question for you as we start to wrap up. So you talked about some of the work that you've done in kind of developing a playbook here. If for our hybrid executives that are listening, and a good portion of our audience are HR executives and even real estate executives that are thinking through this transition, if they are looking to become more intentional in this regard, and you talked about the diagnostic around their organization, studying some fully remote, are there anything else that they should be thinking about as actions they should take right away, or kind of like initial steps in that direction that'll help them kind of become a little bit more intentional around creating this operating system for hybrid, similar to how fully remote organizations have been so thoughtful in the way that they've approached fully remote practice?
Yeah, if I were to put myself in the shoes of a CPO or a leader who wants to do this, I would try and really get an understanding of what the rest of the leadership team are thinking about, and then try and work out how I can guide them towards understanding more about the realities of where we are. Obviously, if we are in a situation where there's no chance, you can still do things on a divisional or a departmental level that are that your organization will appreciate. But ultimately, for me, it's about I think it's really reading what these leaders in the space are saying, the Darrens, the Annies, and so on, but also trying to understand really where is the remote work friction or the hybrid work friction in your organization. And it's quite hard to do this. So a good example of hybrid work friction would be, I need information, I go and have a look, and there are 3 different versions in 3 different folders, all saying slightly different things. I need to speak to Jack, but Jack is away, so I can only speak to him on Thursday, so I've got to wait 3 days. So that's an example. So try and understand where the friction is happening across the organization, from whether it's social connection friction, or whether it's process friction, or whether it's well-being friction. And I think if you get to understand where the friction is, you can then start to pinpoint where you could make the most impact across the organization.
I love that. And I think if there's one recurring theme that I take away from everything you've shared, it's that if organizations and executives don't approach this with the same level of intentionality and thoughtfulness that they would think about any other major business decision or strategy or implementation, then they're going to suboptimize. And it requires self-awareness and understanding of where the company is good and not good at this, and maybe what they can learn from organizations that have historically been remote. But the ones that sounds like that are most intentional here are going to be the ones that really win out in terms of installing this as an effective operating model.
Yeah, I think that operating model and thinking about a new model or a different model to the one that we've we've somehow slid ourselves into, I think is key.
All right, awesome. Brett, any final thoughts? Anything we didn't touch on that you think is particularly important in this regard?
No, I think we've covered a lot. The idea of so the one thing I do believe is that in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, the companies that have gone 4 or 5 days back to office are the ones who are really going to struggle to compete with the other companies that have designed a flexible model that works. So the risk of going back 5 days a week means that you're probably going to lose a lot of your good people, but you also, in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, when companies have operationalized this and built where they can actually demonstrate, look, we have a hybrid culture that really works, and we're delivering on our hybrid strategy, and they can say that to candidates, that's when it becomes very, very hard to compete.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think we're already seeing in some of our Flex Index analysis differences in the ability to attract and retain talent based on level of flexibility offered. So I would agree. I think that's probably, I imagine that gap is going to widen over time, right? As companies get better at the practice of flexibility versus those who go in full-time in office. Brett, one final question for you. For people that are really interested in some of the things that you've shared, maybe want to learn more about your hybrid leadership training program, where should they go to learn more about that type of stuff?
So my website's culturegene.ai. They can reach out to me directly, Brett at culturegene.ai. And actually, Rob, if any of your listeners just want to have a chat about culture and thinking about culture, I could, if you and I had 4 hours to do this, we would literally still be going in 3 more hours time. So I'm always happy to chat, always happy to learn. So yeah, please reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn as well, Twitter, but email direct.
Awesome. Well, Brett, thank you very much. Super, super insightful stuff. I think that people underinvest in culture systematically and thinking about the consistency of that. And I think a lot of hybrid organizations probably are not thinking yet about how do I learn and figure out the best practices from fully remote organizations to apply that the correct way so I can be intentional. And so some really, really interesting stuff, some great company examples. I appreciate you taking the time with us.
My pleasure, Rob. Great to join you, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more FlexIndex content, including past episodes, our FlexIndex newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.